Welcome, everyone. Today's webinar is going to begin in just a few moments.
Bienvenidos a todos. El seminario por internet de hoy, ya casi
I
vamos a
am hearing
comenzarlo.
the language channel. I'm getting some feedback on the main floor, so folks could check on that. And before we do get started today, I'd like to invite Adriana from the Interpreters Cooperative of Madison to walk us through today's simultaneous interpretation options. Adriana.
Buenos días a todos. Hoy tenemos este seminario disponible con interpretación, traducción simultánea al español y al francés. Para tener acceso a traducción simultánea al español, vaya a la parte inferior de su pantalla, haga clic sobre el icono del globo terráqueo y después escoja la función de interpretación y escoja su idioma, en este caso español. Los participantes que no necesiten traducción pueden seleccionar audio original. Quienes necesiten traducción pueden escoger de nuevo su idioma de preferencia. Y también preferimos que escojan silenciar audio original. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Adriana. As we get started today, I'd love to invite folks to use the chat feature to introduce yourselves and let us know where you're joining from. I know we have folks tuning in from all around the globe today. We're excited to have you here. So reach out, introduce yourself to your fellow attendees. Thank you. So once again, folks, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you so much for being here for the third webinar in our series, Unpacking Our Co-op Identity with the International Cooperative Alliance. Today, we'll be considering Principle 4 and ask how co-ops can best advance their impact while still upholding their autonomy and independence. My name is Liz, and I have just a few housekeeping items to share before we get started. First off, as we just heard, simultaneous interpretation in Spanish, French, and English is available for this webinar. Our panelists will speak in English and Spanish today, so be sure that you do select your preferred language channel now. Just look for the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. Okay, so we have an hour and a half together today, and we've set some time at the end aside for audience Q&A. So do start thinking about the questions you'd like to ask our panelists. We have some incredible speakers lined up to talk to you today. So as we have this conversation, please do go ahead and type your questions in the chat box, and you can also add them to the Q&A feature, and we'll be monitoring that during this conversation. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, so you will have an opportunity to share it with your networks. So let's go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure once again to introduce our
Elise,
moderator
excuse
for these
me,
conversations.
can you assign me? I'm sorry for the interruption.
I will in just a second. Sorry, Adriana.
Okay, thank you.
But I do want to first welcome Alexandra Wilson. She is our moderator for today's conversation. She is a member of the International Cooperative Alliance's Global Board, and she's chair of its Cooperative Identity Advisory Group. Welcome.
Welcome, and thank you all for coming. I'd like to start by introducing our distinguished panelists. We have with us today Robbie Tulis, a longtime Indonesian-Canadian cooperator and former director of the Asia-Pacific region of the ICA. We have Giuseppe Guerini, president of the European Confederation of Industrial Cooperatives and Social Cooperatives. That's a bit of a mouthful. We call it CECOP for short. Melina Morrison, Chief Executive Officer of Australia's Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals. Faisal Khan, Director and Registrar of Cooperatives in Fiji. And Yashwanta Dongre, longtime cooperative advisor and Vice Chancellor at Chanakya University in Bengaluru, India. Our panelists will be joined by discussants Urban Kroll, Executive Director, Neighboring Food Co-op Association in the US, and a member of the boards of directors of .coop and NCBA CLUSA. Vasilis Birliakis, president of the Federation of Pharmacists Cooperatives of Greece, and David Rogers from the United Kingdom, best known to many of you as the editor of the guidance notes to the cooperative principles. So, Principle 4. Principle 4 was one of two new principles introduced through the adoption by the ICA, through the adoption by the ICA in 1995 of the Statement on the Cooperative Identity. The other one, of course, was Principle 7, Concern for Community. The principle reads as follows: autonomy and independence. Cooperatives are autonomous, self-help organizations controlled by their members. If they enter into agreements with other organizations, including governments, or raise capital from external sources, they do so on terms that ensure democratic control by their members and maintain their cooperative identity. In the background papers published for the 1995 Congress, we can find some insight into where this new principle, which is no antecedent in earlier formulations of the cooperative principles, came from and why it was thought important to adopt it. The document observes as follows: cooperatives in all parts of the world are very much affected by their relationship with the state. Governments determine the legislative framework within which cooperatives may function. In their taxation, economic, and social policies, governments may be helpful or harmful in how they relate to cooperatives. In some countries, the concepts of self-help and mutual help have been ignored by governments, and cooperatives have been organized through government initiative, sponsorship, and financial assistance. The unfortunate result is movements controlled and managed by governments. It is essential, therefore, that the solidarity of cooperators and cooperatives, based on self-help and mutual responsibility, be understood and respected, particularly in developing countries, but in industrialized developed countries as well. So the paper then goes on to explain that in referring to other organizations, the principle acknowledges the fact that around the world, more cooperatives are entering into joint projects with private sector firms, and there's no reason to believe that this tendency will be reversed. It does stress, however, how important it is that cooperatives retain their freedom, ultimately to control their own destiny whenever they enter into such agreements. So we're going to start our discussion today by focusing on the first actor with the ability to impinge upon the autonomy and independence of cooperatives, and that is government. Recognizing the significant potential of cooperatives to accelerate economic and social development, governments in many countries have made cooperatives a central pillar of their economic strategy. This has had mixed results around the world. On the one hand, in some countries, it has led to the rapid emergence and development of successful cooperatives at the primary, secondary, and sometimes tertiary level, most notably in the agricultural sector, but in other sectors too. On the other hand, where it has involved financial support or other forms of preferential treatment, government involvement has frequently meant that cooperatives have not been well equipped to thrive or even survive when those supports are removed. Examples abound, including the severe effect on cooperatives when, under pressure from multilateral institutions, governments in post-colonial countries adopted structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 1990s. The warm embrace of government has also led to the co-optation of existing cooperatives and accompanying diminution of member control, in some cases inflicting lasting damage to the reputation of cooperatives. A particularly striking case is that of cooperative movements in the former Soviet Union and the countries that were in the Soviet orbit. In fact, it was arguably the dissolution of the Soviet Union that opened the way to the adoption of Principle 4. So, my first question to our panelists: can cooperatives partner with governments in delivering economic development programs or meeting state economic plans without undermining their autonomy and independent governance? And I'll turn to you first, Dongre.
Going by my experience, I think the answer is yes and no. I'm saying yes because states, when they try to use cooperatives as a channel to implement their programs, are very much interested in making sure that the cooperatives remain strong, because that network which they are trying to use is a network which is very, very vital for the state to push through its programs. So they try to ensure that they don't impede much into the cooperative autonomy. It's for their own good, not because they realize that cooperatives need to be so independent, but at least cooperatives have to remain so in order to remain that very effective agent. But also sometimes I have seen how the state would respond also depends on a lot of political and the situational factors. So sometimes it could be negative. For instance, in some cases, the state might take a decision which might go against it. So generally, my feeling is it's possible for the state and the cooperatives to work together. I'm right now finalizing a report which is going to be taken up for the Cooperative Ministers Conference in Jordan by end of April, where I have information now from different parts of Asian countries, where we look at what's the nature of the partnership. And I find that a good partnership, a healthy partnership between cooperatives and state has gains for both the parties. So as long as it's possible that there is going to be demonstrating of this fact that there is a gain for both the parties, I don't think the state would really try to come in the way of cooperative autonomy. But there are examples where it may not happen.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to you, Faisal. You're a cooperative registrar, so you're working for government, and ask you what your perspective is on this question. Are you unmuted? Okay, Faisal, you're not on camera and you're muted, so we'll give you time to get yourself set up, but I'll turn instead to Melina for your thoughts on this question.
Thank you, Alexandra, and good evening, everyone from Australia, where it's the evening time. It's lovely to be with everyone. Look, I'm really going to speak not only in favour of cooperatives operating with government as a preferred private sector partner, if you like, but also that they should do this because of their different purpose. And particularly in markets that are subsidised by government, such as housing, health and social services, I think that cooperatives have a tremendous opportunity to be a middle way for governments when they're trying to extend their service reach, but achieve some of the efficiency of the so-called market to make sure that those services are delivered in a way which still protects the public benefit. I really think that cooperatives offer government a safe harbour and a stewardship model of public assets for services in the interests of citizens, because in many ways, the members of a cooperative are like the citizens in a political entity or jurisdiction. They have the ability to leverage their scale, their core business aptitude, their commerciality, and also to bring some of that private capital, that communal private capital that is in a cooperative, to the service of the public benefit. I think context is everything when we're talking about Principle 4. In Australia, a cooperative is constituted as a separate legal corporate entity. So it can reserve its autonomy and its independence, just like other private sector firms or organisations, when it comes to partnering with government to deliver particularly publicly funded government services. We have a living example of this in Australia right now, where we have won a federal government grant of $7 million to work with communities in the markets, the marketplaces, if you like, the so-called thin places where profit maximising firms or indeed publicly funded services are failing to reach all of the citizens. What the government has asked us to do is to work with communities to build cooperative solutions that are owned by those communities, particularly in remote and regional areas, of which we have many in Australia, to use some of the cooperative characteristics, such as cross-subsidising markets, to make sure that care can be delivered in a way that reaches all citizens. Now, just as Dongre has said, it's not always a perfect situation when we partner with governments. They have to preserve their autonomy by exerting their cooperative principles and values and their separate legal personality, if you like. But at times that means educating and reforming government policy. And I'll finish with one example. In Australia, we have a current situation where we are registered aged care providers as cooperatives, as there are other types of aged care providers. And they're now required under a new statute to have a board comprising a majority of independent directors. This creates a tension and a conflict with having a majority of member-elected directors. And so we've had to advocate to government and win an exemption from that particular requirement for cooperatives.
Excellent example of how to protect one's identity as a cooperative while working with the government to deliver services to the broad public. I'd like to turn to Giuseppe on essentially that same question that Melina has just touched on. So how can cooperatives that operate in sectors that are subsidized or funded by government, such as housing and health and social services, how can they preserve their autonomy while participating in or even delivering government programs?
Yes, thank you for this question, really important. Yes, cooperative can certainly maintain autonomy, but this depends much more on the political ecosystem in which it operates than on the real cooperative alone idea. No? If we operate in the free market regime and in democracy, that is possible. I refer to my concrete experience that I have been for many years in Italy and in Europe. This doesn't mean that there are not conditioning on the policy pressure to orient services. For example, in the last year in Italy, we are very worried about, for example, the service for welcome and integration of migrants, and the government is not totally disponible to support the independence of cooperative. But in any case, we are carrying out many initiatives in Italy with housing cooperative in collaboration with the public body, and also in we carry out many social services, health services, educational services carried out by cooperative in the context of public procurement in the public market in collaboration with the public administration, in many cases on the local level. This is a context really interesting, but depends on the rule that we use. I think it's important to have a framework regulation. For example, in Europe, we are create a general public market regulation by public procurement and also accreditation on concession. This the manner with in the European Union, we manage the public market sector, and we are also introduce some rule to recognize the role played by the social enterprises for insert people or disadvantaged people, from cooperative or SME enterprises, to have a specific recognition on the local level, also to demonstrate the social value that is created by this kind of cooperative. In Italy, social cooperative is really important to provide many services on daily service, but also residential service for care for mentally ill, nursery schools. I think almost 7 million of people in Italy they receive services provided by social cooperatives. I have an example, but in any case, very interesting coming from the social housing cooperative. When from the 16 year to the 90 year, for 30 year, we are cooperative houses sector is supported by public sector, by public policy for housing. On the 2000 year, the public policy on social housing is stopped, and cooperatives is grow up during 30 years of history. This is a very good occasion to maintain a role, but I think we made a big mistake. We start to work in the same manner that work the ordinary builders for home or the sellers. And so when the financial crisis grew up in the 2008 and reached Italy, one very big failure began for social housing cooperative. And this is a very excellent example. Cooperative, they need to maintain our identity, because if we lose our identity and our function, we destroy, because the speculative market, the usual business is stronger, is more stronger than us. And so we need to stay very close to our identity. I say that also for social cooperative today. I say in many occasions, my friend, maintain your identity, because if we start to work in the general market using the usual business approach, we can lose our identity, but also we can despair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very insightful comments. Let's talk about the realm of regulation. So the 20th century saw, I think we would all agree, the very significant strengthening of government regulatory activities, indeed, new regulatory activities altogether in many, many realms in the economy around the world. And of course, this limited the freedom of action of cooperatives and other economic actors as well. Despite periodic waves of deregulation, this general trend has continued. I want to focus first on a very highly regulated sector, the sector of financial services, banking and insurance. How can cooperatives in these regulated sectors best navigate the regulation without compromising their independence and autonomy? So I'll turn first to Robbie to speak to this question. You need to unmute, Robbie.
Thank you, Alex, and hello, everyone. Good evening or good morning to all of you. But before I answer your question, Alex, I need to qualify my answer by first making a clear distinction between countries in the north and the west and the countries in the south. And I represent here more primarily the countries in the south, which, of course, as you well know, has many post-colonial realities. So, so I have been involved in organizing cooperatives and credit unions, particularly credit unions, primarily and historically confined to Indonesia and to the Asian countries. So with that remark, I'd like just to say that while I'm happy to see Melina saying you have a level playing field in Australia, right? A government where you have, well, I should not say leveled, but at least the government can partner with the cooperatives. And Dong Reggie already said that yes, partnership is possible, but from the regulatory point of view, and this is very significant, and this has been discussed in many ministers' conferences in Asia, legal provisions in most post-colonial countries demonstrate a regressive movement, not a progressive, but a regressive movement of many laws. And I think, including the cooperative law and the highly regulated sectors is arguably a result also of a collusion between the capitalist and the oligarch with the government, and it emulates the old colonial ways of profiteering and ensuring that the corporate and private sector predominates. And this is a reality that I see in Indonesia. And I think Professor Dengro may perhaps have other examples, but it is therefore, I believe, very, very important that as a bare minimum, leaders of the cooperative movement should be given the chance to participate in framing the cooperative law. And this has not been the case in many cases. So in Indonesia, for example, right when we have the International Year of Cooperatives, we have cooperative law number 17, 2012, promulgated by the government, but it goes against all identity of the cooperatives. It is all drifting towards the private enterprise system. So we, and Professor Ian Macpherson, the late Ian Macpherson and Hans Mungner, I was called upon with them to be the witness at the Constitutional Court of Indonesia. We were talking at the Constitutional Court, and that law was abolished. It was abolished. And given the fact we have no new laws at this point, so I said that it is important that leaders of cooperatives should participate in lawmaking, because that's where the identity come in, and not done by the government themselves. So I have written an article in the ICA newsletter in 2021 about the fundamental linkage between Principle 2 and Principle 4. Because why? Principle 2 is the control, democratic control, which is internal to the cooperatives, very important. But the fundamental linkage is it has to go beyond Principle 2, because the, what do you call it? The autonomy and independence is by and large defined also by the philosophical underpinning of the Raiffeisen model: self-help, self-governance, and self-responsibility. So at the members level, I believe, we have not just make members able to decide autonomously, as what it said on Principle 2, but I said the collectively search new and unique perspectives within their individual expertise in the cooperative. Because why? Innovation and creativity will help strengthen autonomy. And number two, also at the organizational level, I believe that we have to create and adopt policies with triple bottom lines, like focus on the SDGs, for example, as a cornerstone, and doing so without external support, none at all, or interference. This will strengthen our own identity and reputation and communities in the marketplace. The concept of spin out or spin in is what I have done a foundational theory about, and I'm writing this with Professor Dongre as editor on the Elsevier paper later on. But the concept of spin-off is what we have done in Indonesia, where credit unions spin out or spin off into organizing other types of cooperatives, because we believe in social conglomeration. When you have a conglomerated social conglomeration of good, well economically based cooperatives, you raise the autonomy and independence. You strengthen the autonomy and independence. And so I think that's in short what I think, that we can still navigate the highly regulated sectors. And I know that in Indonesia now, they have this new term called open loop and closed loop. And that's what the government has said, that now all credit union financial cooperatives which give loans to even one non-member is a closed loop. And the banking and the banking regulators will come in. So that's how they are so highly regulated. And but we can navigate that. The credit unions have been able to survive. Well, I should say with some failures, of course, here and there, but that's what's happening. Thank you.
Thank you for that. You touched towards the end of your comments there on something very important, and we'll come back to that theme later in this webinar, but the importance of the economic sustainability of the cooperative, the importance of that to sustaining the autonomy and independence of the cooperative. You touched on something else that is also, I think, very important in trying to understand and appraise government regulation of cooperatives. When in many places in the world, it was the colonial powers who introduced cooperatives. But when they did that, the British, for example, they had a cooperative law, of course, in England. But when they took that to India and to Palestine, they didn't write the same law. They took a more paternalistic approach and gave less freedom to the cooperative sector through these first laws that were introduced. And then I think we can safely say that the governments that came to office in the post-colonial period had learned well from their colonial masters and carried on this approach. So, the remedy that our panelists are suggesting is be very, very conscious of our cooperative identity and understand its importance and what has to be done to protect it, and not simply kind of follow along in the wake of government, going along with whatever government judges to be best. I want to ask you, Dongri, for your perspective on this question of cooperatives navigating this increasingly demanding and complex regulatory environment. You're muted.
I begin by agreeing with Robbie when he mentioned about it's how actively the cooperators engage with government and involve in the lawmaking, which probably will have a large say on what the regulatory regime is going to look like. As you rightly said, India is a country where there is a we call it a British India model of the cooperatives, which came with a very, very top to bottom kind of cooperative setup. And but after independence, when the cooperatives became a state subject, India is a federated union of states, and it became a state subject. And then suddenly we see different perspectives coming from different states. And there were states which adopted a much more liberal stance with regard to cooperatives. It's because the cooperative leadership was very actively engaging with the state and involving in that lawmaking. And now very recently, in my own state, there was a move by the state government to make an amendment to the state cooperative law, facilitating the state government nominating members on the board of the cooperatives. And this was passed in the lower house of the state assembly, but because the cooperative leadership intervened and lobbied, the law was defeated, the amendment was defeated in the upper house, and the state could not simply move ahead. Now, I feel that in any regime where the regulations are of that order, the united way in which the cooperatives participate, I think, is going to be extremely important. One would be, I think, the role of the cooperative apex bodies, probably, because it is those apex organizations which can really get into a dialogue with the state where this is possible. I also give an example how the participation of cooperative leaders helped in India in the 1990s to come with what we call as a parallel cooperative legislation, which is called the mutually aided cooperative law. About 9 states in India now they are into a dual legislative system where the conventional law prevails and cooperatives which want government help and support can continue under that law. But if you don't want, if you want to be independent, you can move to another law, which is under the Mutually Aided Cooperative Act, where government don't interfere, but government don't also support you so much. You are much more independent. Now, these kinds of changes are possible when we get into a dialogue with the state, for which I think what is very important is a very active engagement. In most cases, probably we just accept what the state is going to do. And if our cooperative apex bodies are strong enough, if our federations are strong enough, then it is possible to convince the state. For the Mutually Aided Cooperative Act, cooperative leadership worked with the representatives of different political parties, and they sort of lobbied with the members of the state assembly across parties. So whether you are in the ruling party or opposition party, they made everybody come on board. And that's why this kind of a very revolutionary change could happen. So I think the only way is to really communicate with the state and make the state understand, and also tell them that we are a force and they have to recognize it. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I want to turn to the situation of countries with authoritarian governments. This is something of a sensitive topic. My question is this, and I'll put it to you, Robbie. Can genuine member-controlled cooperatives flourish in countries where government sees civil society organizations as competing with or threatening its own power? You need to unmute.
Thanks for the question, Alex. Before I answer the how, I'll give you a background. And this is my own experience in Indonesia. When the Statement of Cooperative Identity was adopted and promulgated in 1995 at the ICA 31st Congress in Manchester at that time, free political expression as well as grassroots organizing in Indonesia were very severely suppressed. The economy was very liberal at that time, driven certainly by foreign investments. And so any movement from below will be suppressed. And especially organizations such as credit unions, which I have started in the 70s, were also suppressed. They were not given any legal recognition. So it was the apex of oppressive and deeply corrupt state apparatus at that time, in which the hand of the military, say, reached out in every level of government at that time, from national administration all the way down to the villages. Dissent was squashed violently, and human rights were routinely abused. But in 1992, following the Co-op Congress in Tokyo, ICA held the Cooperative Ministers Conference in Indonesia. And at that time, Principle 4 has yet to be added, but yet Principle 2 of democratic control was discussed in earnest at the conference. And what happened is that during that Ministers' Conference in Indonesia, during the repressive regime at that time, which I mentioned, we discussed most and foremost ILO recommendation 127, which is the recommendation of ILO in developing countries, which says that autonomy and independence and member control should reign supreme in any cooperative system. And I think that is also one of the windows that open for governments to understand that cooperatives are not just to be suppressed, but they have autonomy and independence. And in the reform area in 1999, for example, where neoliberal policies continued to be preserved by governments and freedom and political expression was allowed, the overwhelming thrust in the market economy brought about dark clouds, and that is the ethics and morality. So in addition to being able to have freedom, but then ethics and morality come in the way. And so now I come with the how. So I believe that in order for us to be able to to flourish. And I'm talking here more of the credit union, is that number one is education, number two is education, and number three is education. Because education has to be intensified in cooperatives. While co-op laws tend to be more regressive, ILO recommendation 193 has to be more aggressively advocated nationally, and as well as during the ICA ministers' conferences. And I think the next one in Jordan would certainly stress also on this recommendation. Unfortunately, legal provisions, in many, if not most, post-colonial countries, demonstrate again the regressive nature of the law. So most co-op laws grant the government an unfettered power to intervene in any cooperative society. And as Professor Dongri said earlier, India was successful in Andhra Pradesh, for example, where you have the mutual aid, what do you call it? The mutual aid and independent law as an alternative. We don't have that, say, in Indonesia, for example. We only have one law, and you'll have to sort of abide by it. So again, it is subject to some unfettered intervention by the government. Therefore, it's important, I believe, that the autonomy and independence of cooperatives have to be legally guaranteed and recognized in the law. And that is not happening at this point yet. And I'm talking here, of course, about Indonesia. Cooperatives have to be empowered and allowed to develop their own capacity. Governments frame a policy to this effect. So we have the law, and then the policy, and the third one is the strategy that governments have to firm up and consistently pursue a strategy of disengagements from cooperatives in cases where there is still official involvement in cooperatives. So these are the 3 points that we are trying to emphasize in the draft law that is now being drafted by the government. And so one thing before I end, Alex, is also the fact that, unfortunately in developing nations and countries in Asia, there's a faulty argument also in justifying external intervention. Cooperatives are weak, and therefore we need continued external governments from the government. So there is also that faulty argument that is still existing. This is a self-fulfilling argument and compelling evidence that cooperatives precisely remain weak because they continue to have external intervention given to them. And this is where the principle autonomy and independence again becomes so crucial. Yeah. And since 1995, again, bilateral and multilateral agencies still nurture the misconceptions of cooperatives because their experience are limited to government programs and approaches. This has changed somewhat after 2012, when we have the International Year of Cooperatives, when advocacy was raised progressively with the ministers' conferences and with the ILO recommendation 95. But the paradox continues. The paradox continues. On the one hand, the perpetuation of donor-supported government programs and collusion of governments with oligarchs, for example, are more inclined to promote the use of pseudo and overnight cooperatives as conduits for their own programs and economic benefits. So on the other hand, there is a growing mistrust among the same donor agencies and sponsors of cyclical creation of boom and bust cooperatives that under very government programs which these agencies actually support. So I think while we have a very good intervention with the United Nations, I think United Nations should also provide more advocacy to the bilateral and multilateral agencies, because they are the ones who actually support the government programs up until now. So that's why I think genuine member control cooperatives can still flourish in this very, very volatile environment. But again, it has to be education, education, education. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that perspective. It gives us a sense of just how complex the area is and the importance of steps that some multilateral bodies have in fact taken. So, for example, the adoption of Resolution 193 by the ILO. These can provide cooperatives with useful tools in their efforts to ensure that governments recognize their distinct character and accord them the degree of independence that they need to succeed and flourish. Time is running short, so I'm going to move our discussion along. We've been talking about cooperatives' relations with governments and the bearing this has on their autonomy and independence. Let's turn now to other forces that can constrain a cooperative's autonomy and weaken or undermine control by the member users, as if government weren't enough. There are other forces impinging on cooperatives' autonomy. So the whole area of sourcing capital or in some cases operating funding is relevant here, I think. Pointing to the limited ability or willingness of members to supply the capital needed for their growth and development, many cooperatives have turned to external sources of capital. In some cases, this has led to the demise of the cooperative altogether. So I think of the example of our very large retail cooperative, Mountain Equipment Co-op in Canada, which needed money borrowed from a bank, and that loan was short-term and repayable in the early days of the pandemic. It did not, the cooperative did not believe it could turn to its more than 6 million members for financial support. It didn't try to do that. And it's not a cooperative today. The business is still there, but it's the members lost control entirely. It's not a cooperative any longer. In other cases, it has meant ceding a portion of control of the cooperative to outside capital, weakening the influence of the members. So my question is, how can cooperatives source the capital they need without undermining their autonomy and independence? And I'd like to turn first to one of our discussants, Urban, to comment on this subject.
Well, thank you so much, Alexandra. I do want to first thank my colleagues for their invaluable comments in this dialogue. I hope I also have something to offer, but I really appreciated the comments so far. While this is a dialogue on Principle 4, the identity is, of course, a whole, and our values are relevant to member autonomy and independence as well. And not just self-responsibility, but self-help is specifically mentioned in the fourth principle. So co-ops are formed by their members, the people who actively use or participate in the enterprise to meet their needs and goals. And capital is to be a tool in this process. And in order to ensure that it remains a tool, I think others have mentioned the important role of education. I think it is also important to consider first that the members, either through developing their capital over time or other means, can actually play a strong role. We're often swimming upstream against assumptions that outside capital is the answer. As others have pointed out, there are also times where there's an assumption that people are not equipped or can't be equipped and empowered to take their own self-determination in managing their enterprises. And a key challenge that we have is challenging conventional ways of thinking, specifically around the interests of capital and investors. I think a danger is that capital can be seen as a shortcut. It's a way to sidestep the hard work of organizational development, of education, of empowering members, which can be slow, frustrating, and complicated. But I think against many odds, we've seen examples of co-ops that have been able to raise sufficient funds for major projects through things like member loans, and then resorting to external capital. I think along the way, they were often told it was impossible, and yet were willing to find that when asked, their members were willing to put more resources to risk to grow their own co-op. I'm also familiar with multiple examples of co-ops, producer co-ops, worker co-ops, food co-ops, examples of conversions of existing enterprises into co-ops that have been successful in accessing substantial external capital through non-voting shares, investors who had no interest in control or influence and simply wanted to be part of advancing a cooperative. I would also argue that ironically, that there are a few key ingredients that many might find familiar. First, I think these co-ops that have been successful in recruiting outside capital have been very clear about their cooperative identity. They've been very clear who they are, how they're controlled, what the role of capital is in the entity. Second, they've been able to access a substantial amount of capital that is mission-based, often from other cooperatives or credit unions, that has given them a measure of safety against the influence of other forms of capital. And finally, I think they've actively adopted strategies from other co-ops so that when they felt the pressure to accede to the assumptions of capital, they had answers or alternatives. And I think this is another area where apex organizations can play a key role in sharing effective strategies that do not compromise member control. I'll just give an example from our own Association of Food Co-ops. We have many member co-ops that have raised substantial capital in member loans. We've also collaborated with cooperative funding organizations. And finally, we've helped incorporate co-ops that have been able to secure Class B non-voting shares to facilitate growth, particularly in communities with limited access to capital. So the answers are there. I think, unfortunately, that there is often an assumption that capital demands certain interest or control in return for equity. And we've also seen examples of laws that have been introduced to sort of sidestep the control of user members by describing investors, non-user investors, as members. I'll just give a brief example. We were able to successfully challenge a proposed law in our region called the Uniform Limited Cooperative Act, which essentially undermined the control by member users by describing investors as members, and therefore giving them control alongside members. So I guess I would argue, to go back to some of the excellent comments from previous speakers, particularly in apex organizations, I would argue that if there is going to be a cooperative alternative, we need to follow that guidance and effectively engage with governments and insist that co-op law be rooted in the co-op identity and the collective autonomy of member users, and not simply accede to the priorities of other actors, whether those are capital, the state, nonprofits, or other non-user interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David, I'd like you to offer your perspective on this question, please.
Yes, good morning from the United Kingdom. I think perhaps after Yashvantha's comments, I ought to begin by apologizing for the negative legacy of British colonialism in many countries, including in respect of denying autonomy to cooperatives. I mean, again, I endorse what Erwin has just said. There is really an interconnectedness between all the principles. You need to look not just at autonomy principle 4, but you need to look at principle 3 on the raising of capital, and you need to ensure that the way in which it is done does not offend the democratic principle of member control in principle 2. Now, there are different ways in which capital can be raised. I mean, principle 3 says very clearly that some of the capital ought to be provided by the members, and I think that is an important principle. And member capital can be actually divided into two sorts. It can be the voting share that members have, and a non-voting share, which is how you issue non-voting shares to raise capital without disturbing or giving an imbalance of voting to those who invest more. If you don't go down that route, there are other routes that you can go down. As Erwin has said, you can raise ethical capital from ethical investors. There are many people now who wish to see and to promote cooperatives as a means of tackling the inequalities, economic inequalities that are occurring within many advanced industrial societies. And there are people who will invest. And they can be given non-voting capital either through the issue of loan stock, or again through the issue of non-voting of shares to people who are not members. And in the UK, we have what I can call community share issues, where you can go out to your local community and raise capital from that community by issuing community shares, which bear no voting rights at all, and which have a limited rate of return on the capital that is invested. And I'll give an example of that. If anybody wants to look at Lilac Co-op, Low Impact Living Affordable Community, as it was called, up in Leeds in the UK, they raised a considerable amount of money for their project by issuing non-voting community shares to members. Now, to non-members. Again, other alternatives. You can use debt finance. If you have assets, you can raise capital from financial institutions and investors using the assets as security for loans. We did that again in the United Kingdom. We set up the Cooperative Housing Finance Society. I spent my career in cooperative housing, and we set up the Cooperative Housing Finance Society, drawing on the experience of Canada, where they had a mortgage insurance fund. And essentially, we used the Cooperative Housing Finance Society to guarantee 12 months interest on loans secured on co-op housing projects. So there are very, very different ways in doing that. I would also echo what Melina said earlier about the importance of ensuring that you've got a dialogue with government and with the regulators of government, so that they understand the importance of cooperative legislation that is appropriate, of regulation of cooperatives that is appropriate, and also that they understand, most importantly, the democratic nature of cooperatives and how the fourth autonomy principle is there to ensure that democratic nature and control by members is actually protected and understood as being a vital part of what a cooperative is.
Thank you. I'll just note that again, time is running a bit short, so I'm going to turn to another theme, but don't forget that we'll have an audience Q&A session, so get your questions ready. Use the Q&A function to write down your questions, and then our panelists will be invited to offer their thoughts on your questions. But turning to the question of relations with suppliers and customers, the autonomy and independence of a cooperative, and indeed that of any business, can also be limited by the commercial relationships it enters into. A social cooperative whose members are the workers in the enterprise may have a single customer, often a government body or agency, making it entirely economically dependent on that body. On the supplier side, a consumer cooperative in a small town close to where I live fended off the very real threat of big box store competition by buying a franchise from a big box chain. As a franchisee, the co-op obviously had much less freedom of action in the new store than it had in its original store, but the older store survived, and the co-op's members earned the profits from the new one. This struck me as a very creative adaptation to competitive pressures. A more familiar example from the cooperative world is the dependence of primary cooperatives on their cooperative wholesalers and federations. The models vary around the world, but some systems are highly centralized with few decisions left to the primary co-op, while others are much more loosely structured. So I want to ask Vasilis, when a cooperative enters into an agreement or an arrangement with a supplier or a customer on whom it is economically dependent, can it do so without undermining its autonomy or forfeiting member control? And what safeguards should it put in place?
Can I answer? And Giuseppe?
Yes, go ahead, Giuseppe, and start and see what
Okay. Yes, I
Awesome.
answer this one, but it's really connected by the previous question. But of course, if you depend on a single supplier or a single customer, we cannot be autonomous or independent. Often, single commissioning is an indicator for identifying false cooperative, for example. Tools which are artificially created by a large company to entrust manufacturing part of the distribution chain, for example, and exploiting workers. This is an expression that unfortunately we observe many times in Italy, in for example, in the delivery services. And so I think it's important to invest energy and time in economic autonomy, and so also to have independent offer for investors. In the last few years, for example, there is an wave, an hype about, for example, the issue social impact investment. For example, regarding cooperatives, social cooperative first. In Italy, many investors ask me, can you introduce with some social cooperative, because we are interested to realize social impact investment. Okay, I can do it, but when they meet cooperatives, it is understood that the governance is entrusted in the workers' member. They asking me, but is the workers really workers managing cooperative? Yes, of course, cooperative. So is the workers that provide service and manage the cooperative, and the capitalists, they are really scared of democracy in business. So it's really strange and too important. And I think we are three ways to invest to avoid these big risks. The first one is grow up our managerial skills and our ability to demonstrate result with data. We will win over investor, over also commitment, also delivers, if we are able to demonstrate our impact and grow up our economy independence. The second, we need to grow our own investment tools as cooperative system. In Italy, for example, we are the mutual fund created by cooperative association. Fondo Sviluppo, Coop Fund, General Fund is created to invest in the cooperative. Also, CFI, Cooperazione Finanza Impresa, is a venture capital company created by cooperative movement to invest on workers' buyout, for example. Also in France and in Spain, there is interesting tool created by cooperative system to support this kind of investors, and also to have more autonomy. And the third is to stimulate the investment fund dedicated by social economy on the institution. For example, again, in Europe, on the European Strategic Investment Fund created to react to the financial crisis, we do a lobbying activity to have one part dedicated for small and medium enterprises, but also for social economy enterprise to invest money to have more independency. Because if you don't have economic autonomy, you cannot be autonomous also in front to the supplier or single customer. This is our idea, our proposal. Thank you.
Well, that's a pretty unequivocal answer. You know, you can't be autonomous if you have a single supplier or a single customer. So you need at least some diversification. in, for instance, your customer base, you would argue for the worker cooperatives that are providing social services. Vasilis, are you able to comment now? Do you want to comment on this point, or shall we go on? Not sure whether Vasilis can actually hear us. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going. Oh, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Calimera, buenos días. Calimera, buenos días from Greece. Quiero agradecerles por la invitación y agradecer a los panelistas por sus comentarios y agradecer a todos los cooperativistas por estar aquí con nosotros. Llegar a un acuerdo con un proveedor o un cliente único es un desafío. Intentaré dar un aspecto práctico a través de unos pasos que yo creo que tienen que seguir esas cooperativas que están al frente de este desafío, de este problema. Primero, las cooperativas estas tienen que tener muy clara la importancia de mantener la autonomía y tener muy claro el peligro de tener un cliente, el peligro que tienen que afrontar. Teniendo esta visión, pueden pasar al segundo paso, que es el segundo paso, crear un ambiente de negociación que es adecuado para mantener la autonomía. ¿Esto qué significa? Significa tener una comunicación abierta con la otra parte, sea un proveedor o sea el cliente, conocer los principios y los valores de la otra parte y hacer conocer a la otra parte los principios y valores cooperativos y que sean respetados de ambas partes. Después de la negociación llegará el contrato. Tienen que formar un contrato que sea muy claro en cuanto a prevenir malentendidos y disputas y claro en cuanto a garantizar que la cooperativa mantenga el control sobre sus operaciones y que describa ese contrato las responsabilidades y los derechos de ambas partes. Ese contrato tiene que ser revisado por los miembros de la cooperativa. Las cooperativas estas tienen que involucrar a los miembros tanto en la revisión, tanto en la aprobación de estos acuerdos para que tengan los miembros una mayor responsabilidad. Y eso también garantiza que las decisiones están alineadas con la misión de la cooperativa, la misión y los valores de la cooperativa. Después de aprobar y firmar el contrato, es muy importante seguir monitoreando el contrato y hacer una evaluación regular. Al identificar proactivamente posibles problemas, las cooperativas pueden tomar medidas correctivas para proteger su autonomía. Esto en cuanto a la relación con el proveedor único o el cliente único. Pero estoy de acuerdo que la cooperativa que está al frente de este desafío tiene que intentar diversificar los proveedores, procurar diversificar su base de proveedores y clientes para reducir la dependencia, pero también tener un establecimiento, tener un plan de contingencia, porque tiene que, en una posible interrupción, un posible fracaso de este acuerdo, tener un plan B para poder salvar la cooperativa, para poder seguir funcionando. Gracias.
Thank you. Our discussion so far has focused on how cooperatives preserve their autonomy and independence as they navigate the world outside. and relate to such actors as governments, providers of capital, and key customers and suppliers. It seems to me that a cooperative's autonomy and independence depend just as much on its economic sustainability. Sooner or later, a cooperative that does not consistently cover its costs of operation and set aside enough collective capital to fund its future growth and development will find its freedom of action and its autonomy curtailed, sometimes severely, whether through creditor action or government intervention. I think this is true for both for-profit cooperatives and not-for-profit cooperatives. So I want to do a final lightning round on this. I'll ask each of our speakers to just indicate whether you agree with this statement or not, starting with Dongre.
Yes, I agree with what you are trying to say, because finally, it's how strong a cooperative is, how strongly it can bargain for and really sit across the table with the regulators and the competitors, or maybe even the private sector, that finally decides how much of autonomy that you would get. So we need to be an good economic enterprise to be able to get our autonomy.
Melina.
Yes, absolutely. It's just so important that the focus is placed equally on the commercial success of the cooperative business at the same time as we focus on the social purpose through our fidelity to the principles and the values, which can provide the guideposts for that. Because it's much more likely then that the co-op is going to be sustainable through business cycles and other external and internal factors that are going to affect this enterprise, just like any other type of business organization. Whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit is irrelevant, because that refers to the tax status and the distribution limitations or requirements of the cooperative. It's not to its financial viability, but in a cooperative, capital is the fuel for the social impact and has to be maintained.
Very well said. Giuseppe.
Yes, of course, I am totally agree with this idea, and I suggest one other proposal, for example, about some idea that we can do, because we need to increase our competence or ability to work in the business sector. And I put mine, for example, in the bank sector. Whole bank and economic school are mainstream direction. One best way is the capitalist bank, only capitalist bank. But we need to create some school. In the European Union propose a social economy academy created by European Union and OECD. Why we don't propose as international cooperative movement one international academy for banks and investors based in cooperative vision of business? I think is really important, and it's not matter to be no profit or profit cooperative, because whole cooperatives are first of all enterprises, and so this is our way to make our activity, and one enterprises participate and managed by the members. This is our specificity. It's not matter to be profit or not profit, or to be business oriented or social oriented, but to have a different idea of business. This is my idea to propose one way to maintain our identity, but also our place in the world.
Robbie.
Well, yes, I agree, Alex. And I think, as David earlier said, also that we should look at the principles in conjunction with the other principles and not just principle 4. And I would like to stress on, for example, here, principle number 6, because, you know, in order for us to sustain ourselves and to be autonomous, of course, we have to be strong, economically strong, indeed. But there are also smaller credit unions or smaller cooperatives that need help from the stronger ones. So that's why I think principle 6 has to be interrelated with principle 4, so that, you know, that creates the sustainability of the cooperative system. Thank you.
Urban, briefly, please.
Briefly, such great comments. I think the thing that I would add, one of the more beautiful things about the cooperative model is it merges the social and the economic. And the gift of that model is that it enabled working people, whether we're talking about consumers, producers, or workers, to harness their own economic activity to generate the economic wealth to produce the social outcomes they wanted to see in the world without depending on someone else to fund those outcomes.
Vasilis. You need to unmute. Let's go to David while we're waiting. David.
Yes, I mean, I just agree entirely with Melina. You've got to focus on commercial success. If you don't focus on the commercial success, you will lose your autonomy. You will lose as you said, Alexandra, you will lose your cooperative. The other thing I would like to quickly add is I think it really focuses on the importance of appropriate and skilled business management. You need good business plans. You need risk management strategies, including financial risk management strategies, so that you operate your cooperative as an efficient and successful business enterprise. That goes without saying. And in fact, if you look at the history of cooperatives are remarkably resilient. There is a very good report by Dr. Johnston Birchall, which was written for the International Labour Organization, called The Resilience of Cooperatives in Times of Crisis. And I think that's very well worth recognizing. And if I can just echo lastly Robbie's point about the importance of all the cooperative principles. And it's by applying all the cooperative principles, and dare I say it, in accordance with good guidance issued by the International Cooperative Alliance, that you can ensure that your cooperative is successful. And Alexandra, I'd like again to commend, I think I did this last time on the last webinar, the Cooperators Insurance in Company Cooperative in Canada, which publishes a report on how it complies with the cooperative principles each year. And I think that is really good practice. And if more cooperatives did that, Robbie, then and everybody, I think that, we would avoid the risk of cooperatives not succeeding.
Vasilis, are you ready to add to this, or otherwise I'll go on to the audience Q&A. We have just a few questions from the audience. Okay, Vasilis, go ahead.
¿Sí?
Go ahead.
Bueno, yo también estoy completamente de acuerdo con la frase. Es que la sostenibilidad económica de las cooperativas es uno de los pilares, de pronto el más importante para garantizar la autonomía de la cooperativa, pero garantizar la autonomía de la cooperativa significa garantizar la misión social de la cooperativa y al final garantizar los derechos de los miembros y seguir sirviendo a los miembros de la cooperativa.
Thank you. All right, we'll turn to our questions from the audience. The first one is for Robbie. When we discuss the centrality of education, what age demographics are we focused on? IYC 2012 emphasized youth outreach and engagement. In the US, we highlighted credit union sector innovation in youth financial literacy. So what are your thoughts on this? What demographic should we be targeting?
Well, given the principle of diversity and inclusion, I think we should include women and we should include the youth. And I think it is very important that when you put reserves within a strong, well economically based cooperative, that those reserves should be held also for the future and not just for the current one. And I think the young generation has to take advantage of that. And that, again, education will be one way of reaching out to those young people. And, and by doing so, we hope that the countries with demographic bonus like Indonesia would hopefully help with helping the young, and likewise in Japan or in Singapore where there is no bonus of demography, that they have to start right now with the young so that there will be a regeneration process through good education, and not just education but also training. And training means boot camps. Training means not just classroom education, but really, learning by doing, internship and all that. Thank you.
I have a question for Urban from the audience. Can you speak more to the community share concept of raising capital? Actually, I think that was for David. Sorry, David. Okay, community share concept of raising capital. How can you do that without giving the holders of that, the issuers of that capital, right to vote?
Well, firstly, it's non-vote. Community share capital is issued to non-members, and it doesn't give any right at all to participate in the governance affairs or the independence of the cooperative. In the UK, in fact, our apex organisation, Cooperatives UK, has a code of practice for the issue of community shares, and it's because in the UK, issue of community shares is not regulated by our Financial Conduct Authority or the Bank of England. So we have our own essentially good practice guidance and code of conduct for issuing community shares. And that sets out the risks that the investor will take. It sets out the return. It describes very, very clearly that the nature of the cooperative, the project, or why it is raising capital, and what that capital will be used for. It describes the governance arrangements. It explains the cooperative values, the statement of identity and principles on which the cooperative operates. And it then explains to the potential investor as I say, what risks they're taking, the return, the rate of return that they will get. And in fact, our Financial Conduct Authority does have some say in that. They say that the rate of return should be the minimum rate of return to raise the capital required by the cooperative. And again, reflecting what is said about the third principle in the background paper to the 1995 discussion, is that capital is the servant and not the master of the cooperative enterprise. So that's how you go about raising shares. You need to do it in an ethical way, in a clear way that explains to the potential investor from the community the nature of the investment they're making and the risks associated with it, and the nature of the cooperative that they're funding.
Thank you. We have a question from one of our participants from Uganda, and I'm going to direct it to you, Dongre. Uganda had a cooperative bank, which was closed down in the late 1990s by the regulator, the Bank of Uganda. This marked the end of cooperative banking, except through the savings and credit cooperatives, known as SACCOs, which are Tier 5 financial institutions. Currently, there is a frantic clamor to start a cooperative bank. What kind of cooperative banking laws could be adopted to ensure that cooperative banking is promoted without the extreme risk that the single cooperative bank model faces? Any thoughts on that, Dongre?
I'm not sure about the regulatory framework in Uganda, but maybe I draw an example from experience in India. In order to ensure that the cooperative banks don't fail, we have a system of a dual regulatory authority where, apart from the local cooperative legislation, the Reserve Bank of India, which is the central bank, also has a say in the way the cooperative banks actually operate. And some of those things, like the prudential norms which are required for a financial cooperative to actually function, would get applied similar to any other commercial banks or the private banks to the cooperative banks as well. So it's that you have a cooperative law as well as you have a regulatory authority which regulates all kinds of banking institutions also having a say could be a model where it's possible for you to remain a cooperative, but also maybe make sure that as a financial institution, you function well and you don't face this danger of maybe collapse. I'm just looking at it at how those cooperatives operate in India.
Thank you very much. We've had lots of comments in the chat. I'd like to invite our participants to take a good look through that. And we've come to the end of the audience questions. There are various statements from members of the audience, but I'm trying to focus here on questions to put to the panelists. So I'm going to turn to Melina to take the last several minutes of this morning's webinar and just offer a few wrap-up comments. What have you taken away from the webinar today, Melina?
Oh, thank you so much. It's very nice to be given the opportunity to provide some closing remarks, but it's also quite daunting. There's been such a wide-ranging conversation, but there's three things that have really stood out for me tonight. There are many more, I know, so I'm just, taking the lens through my own learnings. I've learned so much tonight about the contextual environment in which we talk about the principles. So much depends on the social and economic milieu in which our cooperatives exist, the political economy, the histories of our jurisdictions, and the responses to, we've talked a lot about the government interface, the regulatory and legislative regimes in which we have to operate our cooperatives. So it's really impossible to see that there's always one response to addressing the relevance of a cooperative principle without contextualizing it. And I thank everyone on the panel for giving me the opportunity to think about the different historical contexts in which we're examining Principle 4. So that was the first thing I took away. The second thing is that I think we have all spoke in strong support in one way or another for Principle 4. And I think this is really for two reasons. One, that is that Principle 4 goes beyond the concept of just being about the way that we act or the way we hold our principles or values to the cooperative. It goes to the core proposition that the cooperative offers as an alternative to other enterprise models. It's the glue of the cooperative. It speaks both, in the one case, to our corporate entity status. We're not loose associations. We are statutory legal forms, and we are constituted with independence and autonomy built into that as separate legal persons, if you like, from a legal standpoint. But the other side of it is that independence and autonomy speaks to our nature as self-help models, particularly the idea that they're modeled on this idea of self-help and reciprocity, and that is built into the principle of the organization. And the third thing that I've taken away is there has been a lot of conversation about the impact and the influence of colonizing ideology in many of the jurisdictions in which cooperatives operate. And I wanted to, I've been thinking about colonization and think about perhaps an idea that we could take from a more proactive model about colonizing as a theme. We have been impacted, no doubt, by the histories of colonization in many jurisdictions, but more recently, cooperatives are as impacted as many other actors, economic actors are in our economies and our jurisdictions by the movement of capitalist ideology, particularly the decades of neoliberal economics. And that's had a profound impact, not just on cooperatives, but on all of society. And there's a desperate need and a desire by global citizens to find different ways to do business that do combine, and we've talked a lot about that, the commercial viability and success with the social impact in a way that we don't have a tension between those two purposes. We have one beating heart. We don't serve another master, as in a shareholder company. So I think we can think about colonizing the mainstream economy more, so that when we're not outliers, we can be the mainstream economy. We are part of the mainstream economy. And if we think of that as a proactive measure, that we can colonize more and more of economic activity, that's how we can exert more influence and start to shape, for example, the regulatory practices around us in our own image, rather than being sort of placed, you know, in a box that's made for a different business model. So thank you again for that, for the opportunity. They're just my three thoughts that really stood out, and I've very much enjoyed the dialogue.
I love the idea of reverse colonization, we could call it, the growth and expansion of the cooperative movement. Terrific. I want to thank all of our panelists and discussants very warmly for your participation. Thank you to our audience for turning out. I hope you enjoyed the event, and we've got more in the works for you. Thanks to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a
Bye-bye.
good rest, Melina.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye bye.